It is often said that the path to hell is paved with good intentions, that harm sometimes grows out of panic, confusion, or desperate attempts to do the right thing when no good options seem to exist. The phrase is often used to soften cruelty, to suggest that people mean well and fail under pressure. But some paths are not paved with good intentions at all. Some are laid deliberately, stone by stone, with entitlement, control, and the certainty that silence will be enough. In this instance, there were no good intentions. There was a decision, made inside a modest house on Queensland's Redcliffe Peninsula, that one life could be erased to preserve another. There was a belief that domestic space could disguise violence, that ordinariness itself could become camouflage, and that time would finish the work. This is the story of Patricia Ann Riggs, and of how her life was reduced, concealed, and slowly rewritten by the man who killed her. Patricia Ann Riggs did not live loudly. She was not reckless, restless, or untethered. She was a mother of 4 whose life revolved around routine and responsibility. Her days were shaped by repetition, school mornings, meals prepared, washing folded, arguments absorbed, silences endured. She lived in Margate, a coastal suburb where houses sit close together and lives overlap without necessarily intersecting. From the street, her home looked like many others. Fibro walls, a small yard, a place that did not invite curiosity. This mattered. The invisibility of the setting became part of the crime. Those who later tried to describe Patricia struggled to find language that felt sufficient. She was quiet. She kept going. She tried to make things work. These phrases sound thin, but they are precise. They describe a life narrowed by pressure. Patricia's world had contracted to endurance. She did not disappear because she lacked purpose or attachment. She disappeared because her life had been made unsafe. Her marriage was volatile. Arguments were frequent. Control was present. Violence, whether physical or implied, shaped the atmosphere of the home. This was not a relationship defined by a single explosive incident. It was defined by repetition. Fear became ambient, options appeared limited. Leaving felt more dangerous than staying. This is how coercive control functions. It does not rely on constant brutality. It relies on unpredictability, on the memory of past harm, and on the steady erosion of a person's sense of possibility. Over time, survival becomes mistaken for consent. Her husband, Edmund Ian Riggs, was not an outsider to society. He worked, he lived locally, he understood how to perform normality. This mattered as much as anything else. Domestic homicide rarely announces itself with spectacle. It emerges from entitlement and control, from the belief that another person exists primarily to absorb pressure. Riggs demonstrated a capacity to compartmentalize. He could be volatile behind closed doors and functional outside them. He could argue violently one moment and present himself as an ordinary husband the next. This ability to split private cruelty from public normalcy allowed him to believe that the world would accept his version of events. Late in September 2001, another argument erupted. There was nothing exceptional about its beginning. Raised voices, escalation, the familiar pattern of domestic conflict repeating itself yet again. At some point during that argument, Patricia fell and struck her head. At trial, this moment would become the center of legal contention. The defense would describe the fall as accidental, a tragic outcome of a domestic dispute rather than an intentional killing. The law would later wrestle with that distinction. But the law does not exist at the moment when decisions are made. Responsibility does. Patricia was critically injured. She needed medical attention. She needed help. There was time enough to call an ambulance, to involve neighbors, to do anything that acknowledged her humanity. Instead, Riggs chose himself. This was not a pause. It was not indecision. It was a decision. He buried Patricia in the backyard. This act cannot be understood as panic alone. Panic does not dig graves. Panic does not calculate concealment. Panic does not imagine future scrutiny and plan against it. Burying a body in a domestic yard requires effort, time, and a belief that familiarity will protect the secret. The backyard was not remote bushland. It was a place associated with children, routine, and care. Riggs relied on the assumption that neighbors would not look closely, that future occupants would not dig deeply, and that time would compress suspicion into silence. Afterward, life resumed. Meals were eaten, nights passed, children grew, washing hung above disturbed soil. Patricia became invisible beneath the glamour of suburban normality. 3 days later, Riggs reported her missing. The delay was calculated, long enough to construct a narrative, short enough to appear concerned. He told police she had gone. He did not know where. There was no forced entry, no obvious crime scene, no body. Patricia became a missing person, not a homicide victim. That distinction mattered. Missing person cases drift, evidence degrades, resources thin. Investigations rely on absence rather than proof. Riggs understood, intuitively or otherwise, that time was his ally. Patricia's parents never accepted the explanation. They pressed police to look harder, to consider violence, to treat their daughter's disappearance as suspicious. Without physical evidence, progress was limited, but their insistence prevented the case from fully disappearing into administrative silence. Years passed. Patricia's children grew into adolescence and adulthood without answers. Birthdays and milestones accumulated absence rather than memory. For her daughter, uncertainty became unbearable. She made the painful decision to have her mother legally declared deceased. This was not closure. It was a bureaucratic necessity imposed by ambiguity. To declare a parent dead without a body is to formalize grief without proof. It allows legal processes to move forward while leaving emotional ones suspended. Riggs continued his life. He maintained the lie. He lived above Patricia's remains. Years later, when he became aware of potential earthworks near the property, he returned to the backyard. He exhumed parts of Patricia's remains and reburied them to further conceal them. This act destroyed any claim of panic. It demonstrated calculation, foresight, and an ongoing commitment to deception. 15 years after Patricia died, the truth surfaced by accident. The house changed hands. New owners began digging to install a retaining wall. They had no knowledge of the past, no warnings, no rumors. Then bone appeared where it should not have been. Police were called. Excavation stopped. Forensic protocols took over. The remains were confirmed to be human. Further testing confirmed identity. Patricia Ann Riggs had never left. When Patricia Ann Riggs was found in August 2016, the ground did more than return a body. It collapsed 15 years of narrative control. In a single moment, what had been framed as uncertainty became certainty. What had been described as disappearance became death, and what had been dismissed as suspicion acquired physical proof. Time, which had protected Edmund Ian Riggs for more than a decade, stopped working in his favor. The discovery site was treated with the care usually reserved for recent crime scenes, even though the death it concealed was old. Police secured the yard. Excavation stopped. Soil was removed carefully, centimeter by centimeter, as if the past itself were fragile. The remains were incomplete, disturbed by earlier concealment, but unmistakably human. Forensic specialists worked methodically, reconstructing what could be known from what time had left behind. Identification was not immediate, but when it came, it was definitive. The remains belonged to Patricia Ann Riggs. She had not left her children. She had not started a new life. She had not chosen absence. She had been killed in her own home and hidden in the ground beneath it. For investigators, the case changed instantly. A missing person file, long constrained by speculation and the absence of proof, became a homicide investigation anchored by location and admission. The backyard was no longer just a yard. It was a crime scene, a burial site, and a record of deliberate concealment. Attention turned immediately to Edmund Riggs. When police confronted him, the story he had maintained for years fractured under the weight of evidence. He admitted that Patricia had died in the house in September 2001. He admitted burying her in the backyard shortly after her death. He admitted that years later, fearing discovery due to nearby earthworks or potential development, he had returned to the site, disturbed her remains, and reburied them to further conceal them. These admissions were precise, and they mattered. There was no finding that Patricia had been buried in a cemetery. What was established was a sequence of concealment events on the property itself: burial, disturbance, reburial. Over time, public retellings would simplify this into phrases like buried twice or moved her body, but the legal record was clear. The crime did not involve formal interment elsewhere. It involved repeated acts of secrecy in the same domestic space. From a psychological perspective, this distinction was crucial. An immediate burial after a death might be explained, however inadequately, by panic. returning years later to disturb remains cannot. That act requires reflection, anticipation, and a renewed decision to prioritize concealment over accountability. It demonstrates that the deception was not a momentary failure but an ongoing strategy. As the case moved toward trial, another familiar element surfaced, rumors that Patricia had been having affairs. These allegations circulated quietly, appearing in the background of the narrative advanced by Riggs and echoed in community speculation. They were never proven. No evidence established infidelity as fact. Their significance lay not in their truth, but in their function. In cases of domestic homicide, allegations of infidelity are common. They serve to reframe violence as provoked rather than imposed, to suggest mutual wrongdoing, and to blur moral responsibility. They also exploit the silence of the dead. Patricia could not deny the claims. She could not contextualize her marriage or explain her private life. The allegations existed in the space created by her absence. The court treated these claims with caution. They were not accepted as mitigating factors. They did not explain the failure to seek help, the burial, or the years of deception. They were recognized for what they were, narrative devices, not evidence. The trial itself unfolded in the Supreme Court of Queensland with an air of quiet gravity. There were no dramatic confessions, no sudden revelations. The facts were largely uncontested. Patricia had died in the house. Riggs had buried her. He had lied for years. The central question was intent. Queensland law draws a clear but demanding line between murder and manslaughter. Murder requires proof beyond reasonable doubt that the accused intended to kill or cause grievous bodily harm. Manslaughter encompasses unlawful killing without that specific intent. After 15 years, with limited forensic evidence and no witnesses to the fatal moment, intent became difficult to prove to the standard required for murder. The prosecution argued that the violent context of the relationship, combined with the failure to seek help and the extensive cover-up, supported an inference of murderous intent. The defense argued that Patricia's death resulted from an accidental fall during an argument, unlawful but not intentional. The jury listened, weighed the evidence, and ultimately acquitted Riggs of murder. They did not acquit him of responsibility. Riggs was convicted of manslaughter and interfering with a corpse. The verdict acknowledged that violence caused Patricia's death and that his actions afterward were criminal and sustained. It recognized harm without attributing the highest level of intent the law requires for murder. For Patricia's family, the verdict was complex. There was accountability, but not the full legal recognition of deliberate killing they believed the facts deserved. Yet the convictions mattered. They affirmed that Patricia had not vanished by choice and that her death was not an accident without consequence. Sentencing brought the moral weight of the case into sharper focus. The court addressed not only the moment of death, but the years that followed. Patricia had been denied dignity in death. Her children had been denied truth. Her parents had been denied the ability to grieve properly. The justice system itself had been deliberately misled. The offense of interfering with a corpse was treated as central, not incidental. It extended the crime across time, transforming a single act of violence into a prolonged campaign of deception. Concealment was not neutral, it was harm, repeated daily, as the truth was withheld. The judge spoke of the cruelty inherent in silence, of the way lies accumulate weight over years, of the damage done not only to the dead, but to the living who wait. By the time Patricia was found, her daughter had already been forced to bury her in law, if not in earth. Having a parent declared deceased without a body is an act of psychological violence imposed by uncertainty. It requires the living to accept loss without confirmation, to formalize grief without ritual. When Patricia's remains were finally discovered, the truth did not end that grief. It reopened it. Delayed truth does not heal. It fractures mourning into before and after, leaving neither intact. Patricia's parents, who had pushed for deeper investigation for years, were vindicated in the most painful way possible. They had known their daughter had not chosen to disappear. They had felt the absence did not fit her life. Their persistence had not brought answers quickly, but it had kept the possibility of truth alive. As of the most recent publicly available information, Edmund Ian Riggs remains incarcerated within the Queensland correctional system, serving his sentence for manslaughter and interference with a corpse. His custody status is governed by parole law and court-imposed conditions. There's been no public indication of release. Time did not absolve him, it only delayed accountability. The story of Patricia Ann Riggs endures not because it is sensational, but because it is disturbingly ordinary. There was no remote dumping ground, no elaborate scheme. There was a house, a yard, a lie, and the belief that domestic space could neutralize suspicion. There was an assumption that women disappear quietly and that families eventually stop asking. Patricia was not lost. She was hidden. She was buried beneath her own home, beneath routine, beneath rumor, and beneath years of silence. In the end, it was not conscience that revealed her, nor confession, nor investigation alone. It was chance, a shovel in the wrong place. Soil disturbed after 15 years of keeping a secret. When the ground finally spoke, it told a truth that had waited long enough.